Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the possibility of airstrikes on Syria, um, specifically against ISIS strongholds. So presumably that would be bombing of Raqqa and other areas held by ISIS. This is obviously a very controversial issue, as issues to do with war and peace always are and should be. Um, I have to say I have changed my world outlook quite significantly since I was young man. Still, I'm a young man. Well, I should say since I was 17. I'm 30 years old now, and my world outlook is quite different from what it was then. And there is significance to why I'm saying this. Back then, I don't think I was ever a member of the Stop the War coalition, but I was certainly sympathetic to them. And back in the lead up to the Iraq War, I would describe myself as pretty hard left for a brief time. I never specifically joined any organizations, but I was definitely vociferously anti British foreign policy. And I remember that well. In fact, I bought a CD at the time. Got a copy of it here, actually. Got a CD at the time. It's from a variety of groups. And yeah, that kind of, I was very, very much on the political left for that period. But in the years since then, I've realized that whilst there definitely is, I've actually learned more about the skeletons in the Western closet since then. But I've also learned that the world is not a black and white place. And the problem with my thinking back then was that I saw it as black and white. I had the passion of a foolish young man who wanted to be some sort of revolutionary. And I just didn't understand all the issues. I thought I did, but I really didn't. And I'm not saying that I do now, but I am certainly more reflective on complex problems. So, there's been protests going on the last few days from the Stop the War Coalition and other similar groups. Um, I'll get to them in a minute, but I want to talk about the bombing, the potential of bombing itself. Uh, let's look at the politics of it first of all. Um, Jeremy Corbyn is facing serious backbench revolts over this. I don't know about the figures, but certainly a significant part of the Parliamentary Labour Party are going to defy him and back the Prime Minister. David Cameron wants to go ahead with airstrikes. This is in sharp contrast to when it was exactly the opposite situation, when a significant number of Labour MPs, 139 I believe, voted against Tony Blair in the lead up to the Iraq War. So this is the same situation but in reverse, i.e. parliamentary Labour members defying their leader. Um, Now this is where Jeremy Corbyn's going to need to understand what it means to be a leader, because he is more experienced perhaps than anyone than being a rebel. Now he's on the receiving end. He's going to find that as leader, his authority is being questioned, just as he and others questioned Tony Blair's authority back in the day. So sort of reverse around, and he can take two approaches, and both approaches will backfire on him. But in a way, he's brought himself into this situation by being a lifelong rebel. On one hand, he could be authoritarian and say, like, get the whip to do his job, um, and sort of rein in those MPs and saying, back your leader. But then he would be accused of hypocrisy because he was a rebel, you know, repeatedly during his time on the backbenches. Or he could have a free vote, be democratic, allow a free vote. They would go against him. Then both the Tories and Labour would say, we've got a weak leader here who can't control his own party, who can't persuade his own party to his line of thinking. Even his deputy, Tom Watson, believes airstrikes is the right approach. Um, his Chancellor doesn't, John McDonnell, but McDonnell's always been as left wing as Corbyn. So that's the politics of it. I think whatever happens, it is going to Impact Jeremy Corbyn. I don't think there's as much wide. I don't think there is the same public opposition to this as there was against the Iraq War. We're not going to see a million people on the streets against bombing of Syria. And one very important factor that's been overlooked in this is the differences between the Syrian conflict and the Iraq conflict. And I find it interesting and a little frustrating that people aren't taking into account those differences. You know, there's a tendency for those, especially on the left, and for those who hate British foreign policy, to simply make this long list of Middle East and North African countries and say, oh, they're all the same. So, oh, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, it's all the same. It's really not. It's really not. Anyone who's spent some time studying those conflicts will realize there are different circumstances in each one. Now, with Iraq, the rationale of Bush and Blair was to go in because Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. That, of course, turned out to be a big, big, big blunder. As a central theme of their policy, then it backfired because obviously those weapons of mass destruction were never found. Um, and Iraq was a massively costly war. So that was a situation where Western leaders did start the war in Iraq. Now, they are not culpable for all the deaths in that war. I don't agree with those who say they are, because I take the view that people are responsible for their own actions. So what I mean by that is, when sectarian groups make the choice to blow up a marketplace, they and they alone are responsible for that. I think it's ridiculous blaming Bush and Blair for all the deaths in the Iraq War. Um, you know, it's crazy because it just doesn't take into account that there are people with a political agenda in that conflict who were using violence to get their own ways. But anyway, incidentally, the Stop the War Coalition has never condemned suicide bombings in Iraq. But I think that it's important to note that difference. That war began as a result of intervention, and that's why Middle East intervention has been so controversial ever since, because everyone saw what a mess it was, um, and that's understandable. Now with Syria, this civil war has been going on already for 4 years, with minimal, if any, direct Western influence. Yes, there's been arms trading, and that's something I think needs to be massively reviewed. I'm not saying that the West is not culpable. I'm not saying that for a second. What I am saying, though, is that these are different conflicts. I think Syria is much more akin to Bosnia in the nature of this conflict. And about 300,000 people, different sources vary, but about 300,000 people have lost their lives. This is a terrible conflict in the last 4 years. This is before any Western airstrikes from, well, I should say before any British airstrikes. There has been French airstrikes. There has been Russian airstrikes, by the way. And one of the main critiques of Russia is that they're not targeting ISIS, but they're targeting anyone who opposes Assad. Now, the Russian policy has been to back the Assad regime from the very start. I've argued before, and I will argue again, I believe that has prolonged the war. Russia claims they're not doing that, but it's pretty obvious that they are. It's prolonged the war because it's buoyed up the Assad regime. You could argue that Western weapons has buoyed up the Syrian rebels, and that some of those have ended up in the hands of ISIS. Now, ISIS is the world's wealthiest terrorist organization, so obviously they're getting the money from somewhere. I'm not going to be so stupid and say, oh, the West has, not done anything wrong. But I do think it's unfair to blame the whole thing on the West. I absolutely think that is not only is it unfair, it's simply not accurate. So bombing ISIS, yes or no? Well, it's very difficult to know. Because on one hand, what the Stop the War Coalition are saying is true. Bombing, is not going to, it's not necessarily going to make life easier for civilians. And inevitably, civilians will die. It's going to be very difficult to avoid that in a bombing campaign. Um, and it's very rare that bombing does achieve anything. So in that sense, I agree. What I disagree with is this idea that there should be no action whatsoever against ISIS. I mean, this isn't just a case that the Stop the War coalition, and I have some pretty strong views on this because I think some of their positions are reprehensible. It's not just a case that they're saying, oh, don't bomb because bombing will cause civilian casualties. They're actually going out of the way to say that we should be negotiating with ISIS. To me, that is an utterly unsustainable and reprehensible position. I'll give you an example of that. Mark Rylance, the actor who supports the Stop the War coalition, I don't know if he's officially on the board of them or whatever, but anyway, he's a prominent member of the Stop the War coalition. He conceded himself he doesn't know the ins and outs of their background, but he says these people are not our enemies. We should be looking at the root causes of why they're doing it. And he's talking about angry fathers and brothers who are defending themselves from Western aggression. This is odious. This is utterly odious because he's ignoring the fact that Western bombings have, i.e., France, have only been going on this year, really on a large scale. He's ignoring the fact that ISIS has been massacring Syrian civilians of different sects from the very beginning, i.e., since they took a stronghold in Syria. So his logic that these are kind of embattled people defending themselves is perverse. I would like him to answer to how he explains the massacre of Yazidis. The Yazidis aren't a powerful country. They're not a superpower bombing ISIS, nor are the Christian minorities in Syria or Muslim minorities for that sake. You know, this is typical of left-wing thinking on the subject, i.e., everything is a fault of the West, i.e., oh, well, we have to explain it, we have to try and understand them and sympathize with them. I think that's perverse. Does this man not realize how stupid his comments were? And how much, I don't want to say that he's sympathetic to ISIS, but it's very difficult to read his comment any other way. And that, I believe, is the thinking of a very large proportion of those in senior positions in the Stop the War coalition, whether it be prominent activists or those on the board, which incidentally, until he became Labour leader, included Jeremy Corbyn. To me, this is a deeply dubious organisation, and their so-called pacifism is very selective. Because, like I say, they refuse to condemn suicide bombings in Iraq by sectarian groups. They have not vocally condemned Russian bombing. So if they're against bombing, why do they not? I actually challenged them about that. They said they had, but I looked at their main timeline. It was not there. They had this official statement they sent me a link to. But I'm sorry, but if you're not going to publish that on your timeline, it means that you don't believe it as much as you believe your positions against British policy. So as far as I'm concerned, they're a bunch of hypocrites because they're attacking British military action whilst ignoring all other combatant factors. That's hypocrisy. Regarding the Paris attack, of course I condemned it because you couldn't exactly not condemn it, but they then went on with the caveat of trying to say that this was angry young men who, I mean, for a start, a lot of ISIS aren't even Syrians. Another factor that they're overlooking. And it frankly makes me mad when they try to present them as Robin Hood type figures. They're not. These are savage, selfish terrorists. These are thugs who are enslaving women, beheading men, throwing gay people off buildings, and who have actually achieved one thing in managing to unite the world in disgust against them. It's very rare that the entire UN Security Council is broadly on one position, i.e., against ISIS. That's very rare. Now, can the Stop the War Coalition not see that? Can they not see that this odious organisation? Another thing that Mark Rylance done was compare this organisation to Mandela. I think the point he was making was that we used to regard, well, some of us used to regard Mandela as a terrorist because of the violent actions of the ANC. But this is very different circumstances. The ANC was a liberation movement against a deeply racist system. Whether you agree with them or not, that is what the situation and context was. In Syria, to try and suggest that ISIS are freedom fighters is disgusting. And I think anyone in Stop the War coalition who uses that term freedom fighter or tries to make some sort of moral argument for ISIS needs to be challenged. To me, it's morally perverse. Even if you're against bombing, at least don't stoop to the level of trying to make excuses for ISIS or trying to present them as noble figures. They're not. They're terrorist scum. That's what they are. And I'll give this guy the benefit of the doubt insofar as I don't think he was necessarily being pro-ISIS. I do think he was being profoundly stupid, and I do think he needs to be challenged. I wish the reporter had followed that up with something, but of course then it would be one big conspiracy against the Stop the War coalition. So I have very little patience with them. That doesn't mean that I think bombing is the right idea, but when I look at other options, that's another thing I want to bring up. This is another difference with this in Iraq is in the case of Iraq, sectarian groups came about, opened this quagmire. I don't think that we should forget that under Saddam, Iraq was a pretty bleak place. Um, and Saddam is largely responsible for the mess that his country is currently in, at least as much as Blair and Bush. But one difference is that the Islamic State, their stated aim is to spread a global caliphate. Now in Iraq, there were certainly Islamist groups operating after the intervention, but the point was that happened after intervention. In this situation, this is the stated aim of ISIS-Daesh before military intervention. They're arguing that bombing will only help the propaganda of ISIS. Probably it will. In that regard, I agree. But what frustrates me is they're not looking at the fact that ISIS' stated aim is a global caliphate. They're not saying we're defending the Muslims of Syria. They're saying we want to spread the global caliphate. Anyone who thinks that ISIS are sort of these noble figures defending Syria from Western aggressors, if you include Russia as a Western aggressor as well, incidentally, seriously, they need to look at this situation. I think the best answer, I'm not opposed to, I'm saying I'm not supporting bombing. I'm not entirely opposed to it either because I really don't see many other answers. That doesn't mean I'm in favour of it because I know that with bombing there will be civilian deaths. But the question is how many more civilian deaths in massacres from ISIS is it going to be without action? It may be that the utilitarian choice is the lesser of two evils. And what annoys me sometimes about pacifists is their refusal to address complex issues. The fact that they will just, it's almost a childlike mentality of everything is black and white. And to me, that is not based on a moral high ground, that is based on an astonishing naivety. So I'll leave it there, but I think these people need a lot to answer a lot of questions. I do think if there is a bombing campaign, we need to be absolutely clear about post-bombing construction of Syria. It may well be at one point we will have no choice but be on the same side as the Assad regime. Such as the complexities of this conflict, that may be, your enemy is your friend. That may be the situation here. But it really gets me frustrated when people make blanket statements on this situation and ignore what the state of the aims of ISIS are. Is bombing a good thing? No, of course it's not. Is ignoring ISIS a good thing? Hell no. And unless they can actually come up with some answers, this is another thing. ISIS is, not ISIS, sorry, the Stop the War Coalition are very good at protesting and for demonizing the government and for saying that all the world's problems are the fault of the evil imperialist West and all the rest of it. What they're not good at is actually producing answers to these problems, which to me shows a lack of responsibility. They will say, oh, we're not the elected government, it's not up to us. But I argue if you're going to take a vocal position against something, you need to have the answer for the alternative. And they don't. Now, I don't, but I'm not I'm not protesting with them. And nor am I vociferously saying that bombing is the right answer. I am admitting that I don't know what the answer is. I am admitting that there are no simple answers. But I am convinced that you cannot ignore ISIS, and you can't just sort of do nothing and pretend this problem's going to go away. What is their plan for the radicalization of young Muslims in this country? I am sick and tired of this left-wing idea that they're victims. And I do think they have a lot of answers to a lot of questions to answer in terms of their attitude, which I think some of the things they come out with is utterly reprehensible. I think Mark Rylance needs to be seriously questioned about some of his positions, like journalists. And talking about questions like, Dragon before MI5 or something. I don't think he's necessarily sympathetic to ISIS. I just think he's typical of much of the far left. He is astonishingly naive. I'll leave it there.